Hello everyone. So recently someone asked me, Dr. Poornima, what is your specialty? What diseases do you cure? And I said, I'm not that kind of a doctor at all. I'm an economist with her feet knee deep in business. And so nobody has ever accused me of curing anybody or anything. In fact, if there's one thing I'm trying to find an antidote to, it is this fallacy or this myth that the world of business and the world of social impact are very far removed from each other, and you actually need a completely different set of people and skill sets to handle both. More recently, I've been trying to bring my learnings at the boardroom to the classroom, and one of my MBA students asked me that, all these leaders you work with across business and government, do they really believe these things that they say about people, planet, profit, about tech for good? Do you think they really mean what they claim or what they aspire to do? And I asked him, what do you think? And he said, I don't think they really buy into it. You know, I think they are saying it because it sounds good. It makes them look like good people and, get a lot of buy-in from people who need to listen to what they're saying, but they've not really bought into it. And I think that's true for a lot of us too. Why, put it only for the leaders and heads of state? I think it's true for a lot of us that we see the world of business and social development as two very separate ends of the spectrum. If you're talking about somebody who's just registered an entity, our question is it profit, for profit, not for profit? Are you, which side of the spectrum are you on? And I think today I'll walk through a couple of, stories, life examples to try and make a case that these two worlds are not so separate as we might think. But it is also true that growth is a very, very important imperative. If we look at where India is today, we are the fifth largest economy in the world, right? And the IMF in terms of our GDP. And if we look at globally how countries have been progressing, these are important metrics to look at to be able to bring about some kind of comparability. And the GDP has also been, I think, much abused, much accused for being that singular measure of wealth creation or growth. But even if we look at something like the GDP, the minute we put the per capita lens to it, in terms of GDP per capita, for all our big growth plans, our rank is 138 in the world. And most developing countries, most emerging economies are trying to figure out how do you bridge this difference between where you are in absolute terms and where you are in relative terms. And that is the story of inequality. That is the story between the top and the bottom part of what you see here in front of you. I also try to think about, where does this come from? Where does this dichotomy come from? And my realization over time has been that we are brought up to think in terms of either or, right? As students, we have to choose between the arts or the sciences. And for some in the middle, there's commerce as an option. We have to choose as leaders between ease of doing business or the welfare state. Do we want to follow the principles of Jagdish Bhagwati or Amartya Sen? It's an either or. And if you wanted to say that you do see value in both, it's a hard space to be in, right? And I think therein lies the fallacy. I think our need to club something into the binaries of the spectrum is where the problem is. I would argue that there is this entire spectrum in between. And for different use cases, we need to be okay with different versions of that hybrid. And so, in this story about growth and equity, about business and social development, there's a lot in between. And we need to find ways to embrace the and of those answers. That and lies in the hands of business houses, that and lies in the hands of government, that and lies with academia. And my own life and work has been about gradually exploring and understanding that each of these stakeholders actually speak a different language. And if you want to explore that and is hard, but it's not impossible. And that there are things in ways in which you can you can try to realize the and. Now you could call me an idealist, but I think over time I have realized that I am probably what I would call a optimistic realist. I think through the journey of hard knocks, I've come to this conclusion. As a young girl, I grew up in this beautiful small town of Jamshedpur, now not so small anymore. And I used to cycle to school. And the cycle would take me from where we used to stay, a fairly, well-to-do area, through lanes of the less privileged, where a lot of children did not go to school. And finally, I would reach school, where we would learn about civic duties and 5-year plans. And as I grew up and moved out to more and more places, I realized that probably where I lived was actually more of a utopia. The disparities were much more stark in the places I went, the cities I explored. And we seem to be very comfortable with this dichotomy resting together, right? The and here is easier for us to live with. But in our choices as business, in our choices as individuals, we seem to think that the binary is okay, right? And my point is to question that. As I started traveling for work, I think cities like Mumbai, New York, so many of them which have pockets of plenty with pockets of darkness. And these are co-located, these are, living together and learning from each other, cross-pollinating, and yet, being unseen. And when I was doing my, one of these times where these hard conversations happened was as I finished my MBA and was giving my pre-placement interview, I was asked this question, that what is the role of business? Do you think it is the role of business to, look at access questions of healthcare, education, etc.? And the naive me said, yes, of course, that is the business has an overarching role to play. And I think you can, today in hindsight, I can almost see my interviewer snigger, right? At this naive girl who thinks that, this is what the world is. But I did not clear the interview, but I think it was also partly because of my inability to articulate what my gut really said, right? And so the world of work then took me through this journey of finance, where one was working with a lot of companies who are solving for um, building out the latest kind of technology, bringing together industry services. And so I got to travel to many hubs of where CEOs and CXOs take decisions about how they're going to grow. What is it that they're going to finance? And my job there was to actually structure their finance in a way that gave them the highest ROI. And this learning of mine in the past made me very focused, because my feedback there had been that, purpose of business is focus, profits. It's very clearly on, getting to that end goal. And anybody who ever gave me feedback later also, if they had to give me a one-word review for Poornima, would be focused, driven, goal oriented. And while that part of me I think was important to develop, my own understanding of what winning and what goals really are has become broader over time. I then moved on to trying to look at how can the role of capital play a wider role. We have business which is definitely, helping to push the growth goals, but can capital also solve for these regions that I was traveling to? Can it also look at skill building? Can it also look at access to finance? Where can I, apply my business skill set to solve for some of these? And while it took time, and that the journey of that is probably the content of another talk, but I was able to make the transition and find a sweet spot where, bringing capital to solve for some of these questions was work that I got to do on an everyday. The journey of traveling to even wider locations, even harder conditions, I think sensitized me to some of the trickier questions. And I believe that a lot of us have those skill sets of what it is going to take to solve for that. And so I come back to my core premise that the idea that business cannot solve for social development or social development cannot answer business questions is a fallacy if it is being viewed in isolation of each other. There's a lot that both of these can do for each other. I think today compared to 20 years back, there is a lot more happening in the field. There are a lot more players across this spectrum. And while watching them, while trying to build these alliances with folks like the World Bank, ADB, with government agencies, I think I also learned that the kind of teams you need to build these skill sets or to roll out these projects, they themselves need to be very diverse. And so I ended up working with or even learning from folks who were from very different disciplines compared to me. I learned about healthcare, I learned about education, and I also found that technology, being a new area which was not so ripe at the time when we were studying and coming out, needed to be something that is embedded into all of these plans. The PhD happened along the way. I wanted to go a little deeper into the why questions. And I found that so many people other than me are also trying to understand why are some regions growing more compared to others? What can industry do better to solve for regional growth? And how do we bring together some of these painful questions? Why is poverty so hard to solve for? And there are many people doing so many pilots in so many ways. So for me, the book on the regional economy became a way to express some part of what I was beginning to understand. And also for me, it has been a way where a lot of people have come back to me to say, can we solve for this together? Can we think about, how do we address this? A couple of learnings that I would like to, list out now. One is that why do these questions arise in the first place? I think after reading some amount, and this is still a continuous journey, there is this thing called accident of birth. Where you are born, what the initial conditions are, what that region has to offer becomes a big factor in whether any state, any set of people are able to actually prosper. This initial endowment, and Gunnar Myrdal actually writes a lot about it, called the cumulative causation effect, where if you're starting with having more, the chances are that that accumulates further. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We are seeing why so much concentration in the hands of billionaires continues, whereas we have large segments that are still, below the poverty line. And we keep the poverty line static, whereas that is something that also needs to evolve. In a nutshell, we find that one, there is this principle of why regions or why a set of people are better off to start with and how that grows. And so if you're not going to do something extra, if you are not as a business trying to think of something special, or as government solve for this, you are going to be in a situation where you have definitely had growth, but you have these pockets of darkness. I looked at data, very large data sets, pan India and also globally, to identify and understand what is driving some of these variations between regions. My book on the regional economy actually tries to unpack some of that. And it so happened that alongside that, me and my team, we were also doing very deep on ground data exercises, right? And in that process, what we realized is that there is so much variation in emerging markets that what the state level story is or what the national level story is, it completely masks what is happening at a regional level. Think about your hyper-local markets, the areas that you have been close to, the kind of businesses you have personally or directly been influencing. The narrative there is sometimes very varied from what is happening right at the top. And so if we have leaders, and I do work with many of them, what we are saying at a Davos or at many of these global forums is a national picture. At best, it's a state level picture. But I strongly believe there is a regional picture. And that brings me to this point, that the regional picture is where people like you and me, the businesses we operate, the entrepreneurship that we drive, can have the maximum impact. And the big story and the big global goals are not going to be possible if the regional economy, in its varied formats, is not firing. In fact, my data also shows that some regions within very affluent states are actually so backward that they compare much better with some of the other states, which would be poor on so many parameters. But we are treating everybody in this all one size fits all approach. So it's my ask to this audience, which is which has people who work in business, which has people who work in education, which has people who work in the banking sector, which has people who are solving for social change or who are influencing how people think and work. This is not something that only the government is supposed to solve for. And this is not something where we should only leave it to big businesses to find answers. If we actually sit back and think about it, each of us is a regional actor too. The regions that we live in, that we operate in, that we have influence on. What I have come to realize is that a lot of us underestimate our own agency. We don't believe in the power that we actually have, in the network that we actually possess. And a lot of what I've studied in economics is really network theory. You know, what we see today in an audience where people know each other and got to know about something and turned up is an example of network theory. So can we leverage our networks better? Can we think about how do we join the dots to be able to solve for our regions better? And can we therefore escape this myth that growth and equity are two ends of the spectrum? Can we instead embrace the and of business and government, the and of practice and academia, the and of you and me, to solve for some of this together and to see each other as true agents of regional growth? For I believe that if we are collectively and individually able to exercise our agency, we will see ourselves as regional actors, and our role in the regional economy is the only way that the big picture of growth and economy can be addressed. Thank you.